What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another episode of the best armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated armies from the past weekend of 40k competitive events and break down what's winning in the game so far. This is for the weekend of January 11th and 12th, 2025, and this is going to be an insane video because this is one of the biggest weekends that we've had in Warhammer 40k. I would say for this year, but that's not very impressive, but at least for the last couple of months. And it is exceptionally big because we are also seeing new results from the updated metagame post the December update that is using all of these new Grotsmith detachments. Now I have to start this video off with an apology. Unfortunately, this weekend was so big for competitive play. Not only did we have 20 plus Warhammer 40k GTs and majors go down, but we also saw one of the largest super majors of the year, the Nottingham Super Major, go down this weekend as well. I actually had planned to do a video on the Nottingham Super Major. I recorded over an hour-long video breaking down the results of that event and the lists that were used in that one. Unfortunately, I was up until about 4 a.m. editing that video, only got it about halfway done, and as a result, this video is also being delayed. So we are not going to be discussing the results of the Nottingham GT in this video. I will have another video out tomorrow that discusses that one, and instead we're going to be doing more of a normal episode this time around. So with that, let's talk about all these events and dive into a metagame breakdown. Now this weekend has proven the front runner of the metagame, and that is Orks. Apparently the combination of the command phase WOG timing that the Orks got in the December updates to fix the truly abysmal timing of their army ability in previous updates, in combination with a bunch of incredible datasheets that they just got that wildly transform the capabilities of the Ork army, has catapulted Orks into a top spot. We saw Orks with no less than 5 undefeated results this week at the Grimdark New Year's GT, Warpstorm GT, War on the Shore Charity GT, as well as 2 undefeated results, number 1 and number 2, at the Denver 40k Fight Club. The larger events of the weekend at 86-player GT, and we're going to be talking about both of those armies in this video. Next up, we also see Chaos Demons doing well. This is mostly off the back of the new Legion of Excess Slanesh detachment, which has a lot of power behind it. Able to buff itself immensely in the fight phase and use a lot of fight phase shenanigans to survive enemy alpha strikes and hit back way harder. Backing that up with a bunch of fast demon units, and it's no surprise that Chaos Demons are doing very well. They did take down the Nottingham Super Major, a 400-player Super Major over in the UK. We also saw them take down the Red Dragon GT, which we'll be talking about today, and the North Sea Slam. I will again be talking about that Nottingham Super Major result in a future video. Imperial Knights also kind of surprisingly coming out of the woodwork with 2 GT wins, both at the Winter War GT and Exterminatus X Big Ben 10. Ultramarines, not surprisingly, doing very well with a wild list played by John Lennon from Team Art of War from a Grimdark New Year's, but they also saw a win at the We Have LVO at Home GT. But Ultramarines getting all of the buffs from the December update, plus having the best selection of characters in the Space Marine faction, is no surprise that they're doing very well. Necrons took down the Prestige Wargaming Feel No Pennies GT. This was an X0-1 result, however. They did win with a draw in the finals. They did end up getting a pair down in that event because the event was relatively small, so there was only a single undefeated at the end of round 4 that then drew against, I believe, a Solar Spearhead in the finals. They also took down the Modena GT qualifier, which is what we're going to be talking about this week. Astra Militarum also doing fairly well with their new Bridgehead Strike detachment. They took down the Guild War 1 and RG Dungeon and KD GT. That's a lot of letters. And we saw basically a similar result from Death Guard. Exterminatus X Big Ben 10 saw an undefeated Death Guard result, as well as that RGB Dungeon and KC event thing. Space Wolves did get a win this weekend at the Grand Clash event. Chaos Knights took down the NYKO 2025. Tau Empire had an undefeated result at Guild War 1, and Drukhari also saw an undefeated result at the Red Dragon GT. That's from Scary Martinez from Scarcast, with an X0-1 record with 1 draw on his schedule. If you want to watch some of the action from this weekend, we did have 2 streams that I'm aware of live. Those included the Breaking Heads EE channel, streaming the German finals. I actually have information on that event, but if you want some German language 40k, you can watch their VODs over there. If you want to watch all the action go down from the Nottingham Super Major, the Epic Flail HQ channel did live stream that one. So with that, that's the metagame for this week, but before we get into lists, I would like to give a huge shout out to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, or in YouTube channel membership. You can join in the link down below the video, as well as folks over on Twitch who support me over there. All of you people are amazing. You allow me to keep doing this 40k analysis, and I really appreciate it. And with that, let's move on and talk about some lists, starting with our front runners, Orks. So first things first, we're going to move over to the Denver 40k Fight Club, appropriately in Denver, Colorado. This was an 80-player GT, almost a major level event that ran 6 rounds. And as we can see, we saw Orks in both the number 1 and number 2 spot, with 2 separate detachments and 2 different lists. So let's talk about both of them. The first one is Joel Davis and his Green Tide. Joel was playing Boss Snickrot, Ghazghkull Thraka, as well as a trio of Pain Boys. The Grand Orc Boy units, those feel no pains, and once per game regeneration. We then also saw 3 War Bosses, one with Bloodthirsty Belligerence, as well as a Weird Boy to get that teleportation buffed up by then the charge buff that the detachment can source. We're attaching those characters into a combination of these boy squads. We have 3 units of 20 boys, as well as a smaller unit of just 10, in addition to 2 trucks, 2 flash kit units to add some shooting support to the army. Those trucks are probably carrying around the flash kits in the early game to allow them to maneuver around the table a little bit more aggressively. Interesting thing about flash kits in trucks is that the flash kit unit, because it is a 40 mil based unit, is huge, physically enormous on the tabletop. However, the truck is tiny, and so when they embark into the truck, they actually take up a lot less real estate on the table, which then allows you to place your orc infantry, your boys units, much more effectively. Last and certainly not least, we have a Gretchen unit as well as a Mega Knob squad. That Mega Knob squad is going to attach into Ghazghkull Thraka to give him access to his attachment abilities. His leadership ability is incredible and buffs Ghazghkull Thraka's melee attacks basically more so than he does for the mechs. But the big thing here is that we are also going to get access to Makari and Makari's banner. That gives Ghazghkull an aura of lethal hits for all orc units on the WOG turn. That's going to supercharge our massive numbers of attacks from these huge boy squads that are buffed up and easier to get into melee thanks to the detachment effects. Now with that out of the way, let's move over to Michael Mann's orc list, which I think is going to be a little bit more of a standard one that we should expect to see moving on into the future. This is an orc tactical brigade using the Grotsmas detachment that the faction got in the December content drop. This includes a Mega Armor War Boss with a custom force field to give his unit an invulnerable save. He has the Mech Captain enhancement, which is expensive, but allows his unit to reroll all of their hit rolls and allows him to attach into flash kits. We also have 3 big mechs with shock attack guns. Oftentimes we see these guys joined into tank busta units because of their new damage output, but today we are running the classic Luda units. Ludas can grant that big mech with shock attack gun hit rerolls and targeting enemies on objectives, and thanks to Tactical Brigade, he can order the unit to gain +1/2 hit, so he can make the entire unit hit on 4s and also potentially reroll their hit rolls, which again gives orcs a fairly solid shooting platform in what is otherwise a detachment that is able to buff melee combat as much as normal. We also then have 3 war bosses to buff up our melee front line. That melee front line is going to be composed of 3 units of 5 knobs, just light little training units that we can use alongside those war bosses to lay down a crumpin on our targets. With those 3 units of 10 Ludas for the shock attack guns to join into, 2 units of Gretchen for utility, as well as 2 units of flash kits, 1 unit of 5, just to act as a little bit of a utility unit and a nice ranged attacker, but we also have that big unit of 10 for the hit reroll mech captain guy to jump into. We're then running 2 units of Burna Boys. These guys are awesome little chaff clearers. They have flamers that potentially reroll their wound rolls, especially when targeting enemies on objectives, and a pretty solid melee attack as well, and for just 60 points, they seem pretty solid. We've then got 4 trucks to carry around the combination of the knobs and again those flash kits as well, and even the smaller 5-man units like the Burna Boys and the smaller flash kit unit on top of that, and deliver all those as well as their attached characters into the fight. And then we've got 2 units of Storm Boys on top of that too. Altogether, I think these varieties of Tactical Brigade are probably going to be very common moving on into the future. I think Tactical Brigade is coming out as probably one of the higher performing detachments in Orks, although as we saw before, you can play a lot in this faction. The WOG update has made a lot of these armies much more competitive. So you can play things like Greentide, you can play things like Bully Boys, you can play things like Warhorde, in addition to this more combined arms army coming out of Tactical Brigade. It's able to buff both your melee and your ranged attacks very effectively. Pretty wild how effective Orks have been doing. We saw them put up a couple of results last weekend, but this weekend they have absolutely dominated, and it'll be interesting to see if they continue to do so into the future. A big downside of Orks in the past has been their utter reliance on melee attacks. The faction has had ranged attacks, but they've always been mediocre. However, the new addition of buffs from Tactical Brigade, as well as their new data sheets like Tank Bus does, have given Orks a new lease on life and allow them to actually clear enemy screens and utility units before they're able to stop the Ork aggression, and that makes the faction much more powerful. Now with that, we're going to move over to Ottawa in Canada and talk about the Red Dragon GT. This one was won by Alice Braithwaite, taking a Legion of Excess. Now we're going to talk a lot this week about Legion of Excess, especially after its big win at the Nottingham Super Major. So I'm not going to go super hard into this detachment, but essentially this detachment allows Chaos Demons to deal an immense amount of damage in melee. It allows your Slaanesh units to trade their ability to fight first when they charge for instead full hit and wound rerolls. Slaanesh units already have a pretty strong internal scaffolding of melee buffs and debuffs. They can impose a lot of -1 to hit penalties on enemies and buff themselves up, especially when enemies become battle shocked, and they have several ways to battle shock enemies in the detachment. In this detachment, we're running a Contorted Epitome, as well as a pair of Keepers of Secrets, one with False Majesty, the other one with the Dreaming Crown. This gives these keepers two overlapping melee buffs that apply to non-monsters within 6 inches of them. So the other demon units are getting +1 to wound from the False Majesty Keeper and +1 to hit from the Dreaming Crown Keeper. The Keepers of Secrets also provide a +1 AP buff to all units within 6 inches of them, so everything near those big monsters is going to hit ridiculously hard, which potentially allows you to get a lot of damage out of your army without even having to commit the Keepers into melee. We then also have the Mask of Slaanesh, which can provide a -1 to wound penalty, as well as a +1 to wound penalty for Slaanesh demons on an enemy unit within 6 inches at the start of the fight phase. This means that you don't even really need to commit the Mask of Slaanesh into the fight to get value out of them. You can run them up within 6 inches of a unit you're going to charge them, allow them to fight first in the fight phase, but also impose -1 to wound with them. That means they're wounding Keepers on Secrets on probably 5s or 6s. They're probably going to do very little damage, and then the Keeper's going to gain full rerolls against them and kill them in return. Following that up, we have a unit of Demonettes in the battle line. This is for the Contorted Epitome to join into. The Epitome grants a 4+ feel no pain when attached to a unit against mortal wounds. That's not normally very applicable. However, this detachment has the Thief of Pain stratagem. This stratagem allows you to pass damage on a unit that is targeted by your enemy as mortal wounds onto a friendly unit. You can't pass the wounds from a monster, but we can pass them from anything else to a Demonette squad with an attached Contorted Epitome to then gain a Feel No Pain against it. This allows you to keep your relatively squishy Slaanesh units going for a lot longer, especially against enemy ranged attacks, which I think is the one weakness of the detachment. It's incredibly strong in melee matches, assuming that your opponent doesn't have overwhelming power in melee. However, getting alpha struck by a shooting army can potentially knock it down, since Slaanesh units are not otherwise that difficult to kill, but the Contorted Epitome and Demonette combo can at the very least blank one of your opponent's shooting activations a couple times. We then have a Plaguebearer unit to act as utility and lock in the backline objective to allow the rest of the army to push aggressively forward, because oh boy, this detachment is ridiculously aggressive. We've got 18 Fiends of Slaanesh. These will provide a -1 to hit aura to enemies within 6 inches of them, again making them harder to kill in melee, so they can use their ability to gain full rerolls. The Fiends also have just a very strong melee profile with 5 2-damage devastating wound attacks each. When benefited from +1 AP, +1 to hit, +1 to wound, and potentially rerolls, these Fiends hit super duper hard and are relatively fast. And then we're able to stave off some alpha strikes with 2 units of Seekers, fast scout moving cavalry that are going to be able to move block your opponent or alpha strike some of their own screens. And last but certainly not least, we also have a Soul Grinder. Interestingly, Soul Grinders are not monster keyworded, so we can use the Thief of Pain combo with the Contorted Epitome to pass wounds from the Soul Grinder onto that unit, and given the fact that the Soul Grinders are already very difficult to kill, this allows this thing to play fairly aggressively, absorb a ton of damage, and then hit back really hard, with potentially up to 8 multi-damage attacks between its sword and its claw. The Soul Grinder also has a just really strong anti-tank melee profile, especially once it starts getting buffs from the Keepers of Secrets and their auras, so this allows the detachment to punch through really tough enemies without having to rely on those rerolls to get the job done. Now with that, let's talk about some Imperial Knights, who had an, I would say, uncharacteristically good weekend. Way down in Australia, we saw Exterminatus X Big Ben 10, which was won by Jordan McGregor, rocking an Imperial Knight Noble Lance. Not using the new Grosmus attachment for them, I don't think anyone's too surprised about that, but this army is almost entirely focused on armigers, including 6 Armiger Halvrins, in addition to 1 Moirax Armiger with a Rad Cleanser and Siege Claw, as well as 6 Armiger Warglaves. We've then got a Warlord in the army in the form of a Ministorum Priest. You can include Imperial agents in your army as your Warlord. You simply cannot make an Assassin your Warlord. That is the only restriction there. So we can take that guy as a little 40-point unit with an invuln save who can stand on an objective, and that means that the army is not required to include any of the expensive big knights. The Ministorum Priest is an Ordo Hereticus keyworded model, so he can embark into a Sister of Battle Immolator, which is a dedicated transport. If he was not in the list, the Immolator would vaporize itself before the game began, but that gives you access to ignore cover. That's a big deal when you are trying to buff the damage output of the Armiger Helvrins. They're coming in at only AP 1, so being able to ignore cover with them and potentially use a stratagem for +1 AP allows them to get actually some really serious work done on a lot of enemy targets. So that Immolator is very important, also adds a couple of additional multi-meltas, which you're never upset about. And last but certainly not least, as a utility in it, we have Watch Captain Artemis. He's just here as a little Space Marine character with a pretty good melee attack that can regenerate himself after being killed, which makes him good at holding down objectives or just being able to complete secondaries. Pretty interesting list. We see the faction move closer and closer to Armiger span as the edition goes on, and we're basically at the final form, I think. No big knights, literally all Armigers this time around in order to force primary objective control, but it certainly seems like it's fairly effective, especially given the fact that you're getting the most rerolls possible from your Lalo the Tyrant's Oath. Now with that, I think we're going to stick with the Exterminatus X Big Ben 10 event and talk about Death Guard, because Joe Loke also went undefeated at the event with that same army. Now this was a Plague Company detachment. We aren't seeing much come from the Flyblown Host Grotchmas detachment for this faction quite yet. However, Plague Company is putting up some fairly solid results. This includes a Biologus Putrefier, a Terminator Sorcerer, 1 Lord of Contagion, as well as Mortarion and Typhus. We have 1 unit of Plague Marines for that Putrefier to jump into, and a Rhino to transport them around, 1 unit of Death Guard Cultists for utility, as well as 3 units of 6 Death Shroud Terminators, the maximum possible Death Shroud Terminators we can take. We have a Lord of Contagion to jump into 1 of those, as well as the Death Guard Sorcerer and Typhus for the other 2, so all of those are going to be attached and gain their bodyguard effect. We have 2 Fetid Blowdrones as well, so for some fast movers, alongside Rodigus and a unit of 3 Nurglings. Rodigus is an interesting inclusion in here because he kind of operates independently. He gets a lot of benefits from units being in contagion auras simply by reducing their stats, and he can further reduce enemy OC values to make it easier for the only OC1 Death Shroud Terminators to take objectives, and not to mention the fact that he hits pretty hard both in shooting and melee by himself. Now with that, we're going to move over to Georgia in the United States to talk about the Grim Dark New Year's SGA Finals. This was won by Orks, Mark Perry rocking Orks, but we also saw John Lennon with Ultramarines go 5-0, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Not too surprising to see Ultramarines doing well after all of their huge buffs that they got in the December update, but this version of Ultramarines is something I've never seen before and is absolutely wild. This is a Storm Lance Task Force, the detachment that allows your entire army to advance and charge. This list is rocking both Marnius Calgar and Robute Gilliman, the 2 great characters that work well together, as well as a bunch of vehicles. This includes 3 Dreadnoughts, 2 Ballistic Dreadnoughts, and a Brutalis. It's fairly useful to gain that ability to advance and charge. It is unfortunate because it oftentimes will lose its ability to shoot when it's advancing and charging, but that's okay. You can combine its mortal wounds when it charges with also a tank shock to potentially do a bunch of damage when this thing connects with its opponents and then hit fairly hard as well. It loves to get +1 to wound from Oaths of Moment on top of its already twin-linked melee attacks, and it can embark into one of the other units that we're taking. These other units include 2 Stormspeeder Hammer Strikes and a Storm Raven gunship. Now, the Hammer Strikes are incredibly useful for their ability to strip cover from enemies, but they also have a bunch of relatively mid-strength, high-impact shooting, including 3 Melta shots, as well as a 2-shot missile launcher. When those guys are benefiting from +1 to wound from Oaths of Moment as well, they can hit well above their weight class, and also flip their lighter attacks like their grenade launchers into another target to strip cover from it for the lower AP units like the Ballistic Dreadnoughts. Last and certainly not least, we also have a Storm Raven gunship. This can embark one of the Dreadnoughts at the start of the game, but it can also act as a very solid firing platform. It also loves to get that +1 to wound, and it can get -1 to hit and wound from the defensive Stormlance stratagem. Following that up, we have a bunch of utility. This includes a Scout Squad, a Reaver Squad, an Outrider Squad, an Infiltrator Squad, and a Company Hero Squad. That's going to join into Marnius Calgar to give him the benefit of his leadership ability. The Outrider Squad's important there because we also have access to Lance for mounted units, and we can potentially skirmish with our opponent using a reactive move on anything in the detachment, thanks to that Stormlance task force. This army is absolutely wild. It makes sense, I think, in hindsight. It all seems to work together fairly well and make great use of the new +1 to wound that the army gained access to in the December update, but definitely not something I would have expected to see top a GT. But obviously, if anybody can do it, it's probably John Lennon. Now with that, we're going to move over to Italy and talk about the GT qualifier Modena. This event was won by Giorgio Castelli running Necrons, and unsurprisingly, we saw Necrons running a Star Shatter Arsenal, the new Grazmus detachment that has a lot of good numbers in it. It makes your guys fast, it makes them hard to kill, and it makes them do damage. Those are all good things to do as far as I'm concerned. We have a Catacomb Command Barge with Dread Majesty, giving him a 6-inch aura of reroll hit and wound rolls of 1 for non-Titanic units. This allows you to get basically access to a second incarnation of the Silent King somewhere else on the table, or use the Silent King's ability to ignore modifiers and then also still grant your units reroll 1s. The Catacomb Command Barge is also important here because he has an aura that improves OC values, and one way to defeat Star Shatter Arsenal that we've been seeing prop up is just spamming high OC light units that Star Shatter can't efficiently remove. You can keep them low on primary score until they're out of running to win. We also have a Scorpic Lord with a Chrono Impedance Field to give a unit -1 damage, and a Technomancer with Demanding Leader to allow a unit to fall back and shoot. Last and certainly not least, we also had the Silent King. The Silent King's basically the best place for buffs to go in this detachment. Giving him defensive buffs like Feel No Pains, -1 damage, and reactive moves makes the Silent King super difficult to deal with, and he's just the highest wound count non-Titanic vehicle in the army that is able to benefit from all those buffs. So he feels like a pretty easy inclusion in this detachment. Moving forward, we also have a Canoptic Reanimator as well as 2 Canoptic Spiders, so we have 2 individual auras of 6+ Feel No Pain for these vehicles. The Reanimator is also going to make your units even harder to deal with by doubling the reanimation characteristic. We have a unit of Canoptic Scarab Swarms for utility, and as well as a big unit of Canoptic Wraiths with claws to attach in with that Technomancer, 1 unit of Cryptothralls to further improve the survivability of that unit, as well as 3 Doomsday Arcs and 3 Locust Destroyers for utility. Now, the core of the list is pretty classic. 3 Doomsday Arcs and the Silent King is kind of how most of these lists have been being built. However, the introduction of units like those Wraiths, as well as the Command Barge to improve the OC of those Wraiths, gives it a lot more mid-board control than we've been seeing out of a lot of Star Shatter lists, and I think that's why we're seeing this variety of the detachment see success. Now, with that, we're going to move over to Stoughton, Wisconsin, and another boogeyman of the metagame, Astra Militarum. Now we're going to talk about both of these top armies in this video, but what I want to talk about right now is the man, the myth, legend himself returning to the top tables, Wesley St. Hines, aka Nemo the Fish, rocking Astra Militarum in a bridgehead strike. Now we already saw, we're going to call him Nemo, it sounds more whimsical, I guess. I don't know. We already saw him have incredible success with an almost unstoppable version of Militarum infantry spam. And then, almost immediately, as soon as he started getting traction with that variety, a detachment came out that perfectly synergized with his way of playing Militarum. While it may be a good indicator of player skill, based on reports, I think that the infantry spam style of Militarum that Nemo pioneered is probably the most consistent way to play them. It's much more difficult to pin them down into a corner like you can with more tank-oriented varieties if the army is literally just consistent of hundreds and hundreds of deep-striking infantry. That being the case, that style of Militarum getting huge buffs from Bridgehead Strike, I think just makes it super-duper strong. And at least in the index version of Militarum, I do think that it is one of the front-runners of the game. That said, of course, they are getting a new codex in a couple of weeks, so we are probably going to see that archetype get shuffled around a little bit. Although they're going to reroll their wound rolls now, so maybe not. Maybe it's just even better. I don't know. This army is composed of a platoon command squad, 2 Death Corps marshals, 3 Militarum Tempestus command squads, God's Ghosts, Ursula Creed, Sly Marbo. Now, the Death Corps marshals are important because we're going to jump them into 2 units of 10 Death Corps of Krieg. That is for the detachment's stratagem to fire artillery at their own position, deal mortal wounds to enemies, and then potentially kill enemies that are engaging into your Death Corps, but also extricate the Death Corps themselves from combat by simply killing your own models that your opponent is touching, and then also dealing additional free damage to the unit engaging you. The Death Corps then get to feel no pain against those mortal wounds thanks to the attached marshal, and then can regenerate models back to the unit thanks to their med pack, so they don't even really suffer that much damage from shooting themselves in the back, and are able to accrue passive damage on the enemy. Sly Marbo is also in here for his incredible ability to act as a utility unit. He can double move himself by shooting his gun, potentially even move himself in the opponent's turn by overwatching, since he moves every time he shoots. And all of those moves are benefiting from orders like move, move, move for additional 3 speed, making him basically the fastest model in the game, and able to complete objectives incredibly quickly. We have a unit of Kadish and Jungle Fighters for scouting, to clear out and push back enemy forward operators, 4 units of 10 Tempestus Scions to attach those Tempestor Primes into and unlock the full Scion combo, where you can get additional attacks, +1 to hit, sustained hits, reroll hits when you target enemies on objectives, +1 strength and +1 to wound, potentially ignore cover from all of these stratagems and abilities in the detachment as well. Following that up with another unit of 5 Scions for a nice little utility squad. 3 units of 3 heavy weapon teams with mortars to, again, clear out enemy screening units, potentially punch a hole in their backline by killing things like cultists and Gretchen, then drop in these big Scion squads in a future turn. Having a long-range infantry gun is also good for stratagems like their ignore cover strat. We then have a unit of Khazarkin for some additional scouting and damage output in the early game, 1 unit of Tempestus Aquilons, as well as an armored sentinel and a single Ogren bodyguard. Also, as Nemo is wont to do, these guys are all nicknamed after characters and units from Halo, which is one of my favorite sci-fi franchises, so I appreciate that. Now with that, we're going to move back over to Canada for the Grand Clash GT. This was a smaller 30-player GT and was won by Space Wolves. I guess kind of appropriate for Canada. It's kind of snowy up there. Dan Bruce was rocking Space Wolves for the event and won with a Champions of Russ. It's interesting to see Space Wolves as the non-codex compliant frontrunner for the Space Marine faction right now, at least until we talk about Nottingham GT, where we did see Blood Angels do fairly well, because there are a lot of archetypes running around using no non-compliant units in order to gain their +1 to wound buff in different chapters to unlock the synergies that they have with their chapter-specific detachments. Not really seeing so much of that this time around. That's almost certainly more viable in Dark Angels, Blood Angels, and Black Templars. The Space Wolf specific detachments have analogs in compliant Space Marines, where you can just play Ultramarines if you wanted to, and they are also, I think, a little bit more synergistic with Space Wolves' immense number of custom units. So in most cases, Space Wolves are a little overshadowed by Ultramarines, but they still have their own thing going on. This list was playing a ton of characters: Bjorn the Fell-Handed, Logan Grimnir, Ragnar Blackmane, a Terminator Chaplain, a Phobos Lieutenant, a Combi Weapon Lieutenant, a Thunderwolf Battle Leader, as well as a Thunderwolf Lord with Black Death.
We have a 5-man Assault Intercessor squad, a 5-man Reaver squad for that Phobos Lieutenant to jump into to give his shoot and move that they can then charge afterwards. A 5-man Scout squad, 10 Wolfguard Terminators. Pretty interesting to see these guys here. We are rocking those with a majority Storm Shields and Thunderhammers alongside 2 Cyclone Missile Launchers because the Wolfguard Terminators get to mix and match the stuff that they're taking. That's where our Terminator Chaplain is going to be jumping into to give those guys +1 to wound in melee. We also then have 2 units of Thunderwolf Cavalry, a unit of 6 to attach the characters into, as well as a unit of 3 just to act as utility and a little bit of a counterpunch, and then some additional armor, a Gladiator Lancer and an Impulsor. The Lancer's good, especially if you are expecting the mirror match, since the high AP shooting is going to be able to punch through other Space Marine tanks fairly effectively, so it gives you a good long-range option. And then the Impulsor is a good transport for the Assault Intercessors, who are going to jump in with Ragnar Blackmane, who's going to give them advance and charge. Pretty straightforward list here. This is kind of classic Space Marines. We have a lot of forward operation from the Scouts, the Reavers, pretty solid melee trading units. Thunderwolf Cavalry and Wolfguard Terminators can act a little bit more aggressively, but if we need to, we can kill enemies pretty efficiently with Ragnar Blackmane or just the 3-man Thunderwolf Cavalry squad in the early game. Now with that, we're going to move over to Rayton, Missouri, where we saw NYKO go down. This was a 48-player GT and was won by Dan Salmons running Chaos Knights. Dan was playing a fairly standard variety of Chaos Knights, running a War Dog Stalker with Aura of Terror to lock in objectives, 6 War Dog Brigands, as well as 4 War Dog Carnivores, allying in some demons as well. We have a Nurgling unit for some infiltration, a Beast of Nurgle unit unlocked by the Nurglings, a Demonette unit who is there as a high OC aggressive infantry squad, and then also that unlocks the ability to take a Seeker unit. So we have 2 units that can forward operate and prevent enemies from movement blocking the War Dogs. While they can Knights of Shade through enemy models, one of the ways to defeat War Dogs is to stand in their landing zone. You can stand somewhere around 8 to 10 inches away from them and prevent them from completing a movement within your engagement range, which pushes back their movement by 2, 3, or 4 inches. And having a bunch of units to get in the way of that allows the War Dogs to advance up the table unmolested. So these forward operators are really important. Now with that, we're going to be moving back to the Guild War 1 GT, where Jordan Knack went 5-0 with Tau Empire. Jordan was playing a Montcad detachment, the aggressive early game focused detachment for Tau that games in lethal hits in the first couple of battle rounds. This included 3 Cadre Fireblades and an Enforcer battlesuit with coordinated exploitation. This allows the Enforcer to guide for another unit and grant that unit sustained hits 1, which is huge for the breacher focus that this army has. Those breacher teams are okay with lethal hits. They do have a high shot volume and mid strength, so the lethal hits are useful for them, especially if they're not benefiting from their wound rerolls when targeting enemies and objectives. But their attacks are still for pretty high value with wound rerolls, so they get a lot more value out of sustained hits. So being able to sustain hits for those units is enormous. We then have 3 breacher teams as well as 3 Devilfish in order to carry those breacher teams and their Cadre Fireblades around, and then we're backing that up with some long range shooting. 2 broadside battlesuits, a Star Scythe battlesuit team, this one equipped with flamers to attach that Enforcer commander into, as well as a unit of crew carnivores, a Pathfinder team, and a Piranha for forward operation and utility, 2 Skyray gunships for some long-range firepower, and 2 units of stealth battlesuits to guide and grant their reroll 1s to hit. So we have a pretty solid backline core of shooting between the Hammerhead and Skyray gunships and the broadside battlesuits. Fairly standard stuff from Montcad. Definitely feels like you do need to force the high OC faster units available in this attachment in order to get the maximum value out of it. But it certainly gives you a lot of infantry sweeping, which is incredibly important right now. And it also gives you a lot of primary objective control, which is something that Tau can typically struggle with if they're not focusing heavily on auxiliaries. And with that, we're going to talk about our last list for the day, a faction that only went X0-1, but one that I would be remiss if I did not talk about. That is Rid Van Martinez, Skari from Scardcast, running Drukhari. Skari was playing a Sky Splinter Assault. This included an Archon with the Nightmare Shroud to prevent Overwatch, a Beastmaster for scouting and early game control, Lelith Hasprax, as well as Urian Rakarth, 2 units of Rax, as well as a unit of Witches for Lelith to join into to benefit from her leadership ability. We then have 2 Venoms and a Raider in our dedicated transport slot to carry these guys to the fight, a Court of the Archon, so we can potentially kit out one of those Raiders with the full combo of the Archon, the Court, and the Kabalite Warrior Squad, squad, probably combat squadded on one of the Venoms to then let the entire unit fit inside a Raider to then disembark and get all the Sky Splinter Assault disembarkation benefits. We have 2 Chronos to regenerate pain tokens. That is one of the downsides of playing Sky Splinter versus Real Space Raid, is a lack of pain tokens, especially early on in the game. 1 unit of 3 Grotesques for a little bit of a beefier control unit, 2 units of Mandrakes for utility, and some backline shooting provided by Scourges, one of them equipped with Haywire Blasters, the other one with Dark Lances. 1 Void Raven Bomber. Now they did get a little bit of a points increase. Hard to fit the double Void Raven Bombers in there, but the unit is still very strong with its high volume of pretty decent attacks. And we have some late game melee punch provided by 2 Talos. These guys are equipped with Haywire Blasters and Liquefier guns. Fairly standard Drukhari stuff so far. Interesting to see the Void Raven Bombers still seeing play even after they did get nerfed once again, but it remains as one of 40k's more playable aircraft datasheets. So it's nice to have at least one of those wandering around. The focus on a combination of the Capellite and Witch units as well as the Homunculus Coven stuff is interesting for Sky Splinter Assault, since it's a little rare that we see the Homunculus Coven units get played in Sky Splinter, so then since they tend to have less synergy with the detachment rule. But it seems like we're focusing very heavily on making that Court of the Archon brickwork, especially alongside all of the benefits that Sky Splinter Assault can grant them. And with that, those are all of the best armies in Warhammer 40k for this week. Let me know down in the comment section which one is your favorite. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.